My daughter called it a gift. She said the lake house in Oregon was exactly what I needed after 32 years of cardiology. 2 weeks of fishing, silence, and mountain air. She even packed my bag. I remember thinking how thoughtful she had become. I remember thinking my son-in-law had finally grown into the man I'd hoped she'd married. I was wrong about both of them. I pretended to leave. I watched from a distance instead. And on the third night, my neighbor crossed the street in the dark and told me something that stopped my heart more completely than any arrhythmia I had ever treated. She told me what my daughter had been doing while I slept under my own roof. When I heard it, I understood that everything I had spent 32 years building was already halfway out the door. Before we go any further, please subscribe to Ember Vengeance and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story changed how I think about family, trust, and the kind of evidence you need to protect yourself from the people who claim to love you. The first sign came on a Tuesday in March, 7 months before any of this began to make sense. I had come downstairs at 6 in the morning the way I always did, earlier than everyone else in the house, earlier than the sun over the Cascades. My daughter and my son-in-law had been staying with me since December, a temporary arrangement after their apartment lease ran out, and they were, as my daughter put it, between situations. I did not press for details. She was 34, and I had learned long ago that pressing for details with her produced walls, not answers. The coffee maker was already running. That struck me immediately, because I was always the first one awake. Always. 32 years of hospital rounds had wired my body to rise at 5:45 regardless of circumstance. I stepped into the kitchen and found my son-in-law standing at the counter with his back to me. Leafing through a stack of papers, he quickly folded and slid under the cutting board when he heard my footsteps. "Good morning," I said. He turned and smiled with every tooth showing. "Morning, Doc." Couldn't sleep. He called me Doc. He had called me that since the first time my daughter brought him home 6 years ago, and I had never corrected it because I assumed it would eventually become Dad. It never did. In retrospect, that told me something. I poured my coffee and watched him make small talk about the weather, about a hiking trail he wanted to try, about whether the Blazers had a shot this season. His hands were slightly too still on the counter. Men who have nothing to hide do not hold their hands that deliberately. After he went back upstairs, I lifted the cutting board. The papers were gone. I stood there in my kitchen in the blue early light and turned that over in my mind the way I used to turn difficult diagnoses over, not rushing to a conclusion. Cataloging what I knew. He had been awake before me. He had been reading something. He had hidden it when he heard me coming. Those were facts. Everything else was speculation, and I had spent 3 decades learning the difference. Over the following 2 weeks, I began paying a different kind of attention. I noticed that my son-in-law had taken an unusual interest in my home office. He had been in there 3 times that I could verify, always with a plausible reason. Once to use the printer, once to borrow a stapler, once because he said he had heard a strange noise from the baseboard heater and wanted to check it. I checked after him that last time. The baseboard heater was fine. My filing cabinet, however, had a small dent near the lower lock that had not been there before, fresh metal showing through the paint. I checked the cabinet itself. Everything appeared to be in order, but my medical practice documents, the partnership buyout agreement from when I had sold my share of Portland Cardiology Associates 4 years ago, sat upside down in a folder that I kept facing one direction. Always. A habit from years of chart organization. Someone had gone through that folder and replaced the contents without noticing that detail. The buyout settlement had been $480,000. My house in Southwest Portland was worth $900,000 on the current market. My retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, the vacation property I still owned on the Washington coast. My son-in-law was an accountant by training. He understood asset valuation better than most. My daughter came to me at dinner that same week. She brought it up the way people bring up things they have been rehearsing, just a little too smoothly, the words landing without the roughness of genuine, spontaneous thought. "Dad," she said, "have you thought at all about updating your estate documents, just to make sure everything is organized?" I set my fork down and looked at her. She held my gaze for 2 full seconds before looking at her plate. "What's prompting that?" I asked. She shrugged. You're not getting younger. We just want things to be clear. We. I filed that word carefully. My son-in-law added, without looking up, it's really just practical. Estate attorneys say most people wait too long. I made a non-committal sound and changed the subject to something about the neighbor's new fence. But I watched them for the rest of the meal. They communicated with their shoulders, the way couples do when they have developed a private language. His barely lifted. Hers fell slightly, confirmation passing silently across the table. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan and gave myself permission to think the thought I had been keeping at the edges of my consciousness. My daughter and my son-in-law were planning something. I was 63 years old, in good health, in full command of my faculties, with no cognitive decline of any kind. But I had enough experience with estate litigation to know what it looked like when someone was building a case that those facts were not true. The questions about my documents, the gentle suggestions about updating my will, the survey of my assets, these were not the actions of people looking out for my well-being. These were the early stages of a framework to have me declared incompetent. I got up at 2 a.m. and went down to my office and sat in the dark for a long time. The anger came in one clean wave, and then I let it go. Anger is a poor tool for investigation. I had watched enough expert witnesses lose their credibility on the stand because emotion overtook methodology. I could not afford that now. What I needed was evidence. And to get evidence, I needed them to move freely, without knowing I was watching. I needed to disappear. It took me 4 days to plan it properly. I told them over breakfast on a Friday, keeping my voice easy and my posture loose. I had been thinking about the place in Washington, I said. The fish were running. I had not been up there since the previous fall. 2 weeks seemed right. My daughter's reaction came half a second too late to be genuine. That's wonderful, Dad. You deserve the break. My son-in-law said nothing for a moment, then looked up from his phone and smiled. Sounds perfect. Don't worry about anything here. Don't worry about anything here. I'd heard that before, 7 months earlier, almost word for word. I spent the next day performing the departure convincingly. Fishing gear from the garage, waders and tackle box, and the old spinning rod I had not used in 3 years. I spread a Washington state map across the dining room table and traced a route with my finger while my daughter looked on. I booked a cabin reservation on my phone, making sure she could I packed a suitcase with 3 days of clothes and my reading glasses and the kind of mundane personal items that communicate genuine leisure travel. Underneath all of it, I packed other things. The small monocular I had used for birdwatching before my wife passed. A legal pad. A voice recorder no larger than a thumb drive. My old hospital ID badge, expired but still bearing my photograph, and the institutional gravity of 32 years. I hugged my daughter at the door. She held on a moment longer than usual. I chose to notice that without interpreting it. My son-in-law shook my hand firmly on the porch. Take care of yourself, Doc. I will, I said, and I meant it differently than he understood. I drove north on I-5 for 20 minutes, then exited and doubled back on surface streets to Multnomah, where a commercial motel sat off Barber Boulevard between a Vietnamese restaurant and a tire shop. I paid cash for 3 nights and asked for a room facing the parking lot. The desk clerk was 20 years old and uninterested in my life, which was exactly what I needed. I ate a sandwich I had packed, drank a bottle of water, and waited for dark. My neighborhood had been built in the 1950s, the kind of southwest Portland block where the houses had deep porches and mature Douglas firs that created useful shadow after 9 at night. I knew every property on my street. I knew which house had been vacant since the previous fall after the owners relocated to Arizona. I knew the lockbox code because I had overheard the listing agent giving it to a prospective buyer 3 months earlier. 4 digits. The kind of thing a cardiologist with a good memory does not forget. I parked 2 blocks over and walked in through the side yard. The vacant house smelled of dust and old carpet and the particular loneliness of empty rooms. I moved through it without lights and found the front bedroom window that looked directly across the street at my house. I set up my camp chair, adjusted the monocular, and trained it on my own living room. They were both awake. My son-in-law paced near the front windows, My daughter sat on the couch with her laptop open, her posture forward, fingers moving, not browsing, working, coordinating. I watched them for 4 hours that first night and did not sleep until nearly 3 in the morning. I came back the second night and the third. I documented the lights, the schedule, the visitors. A man came on Wednesday afternoon in a gray sedan that I did not recognize. He carried a leather portfolio and wore the particular expression of someone performing a professional service rather than a social call. He stayed 45 minutes. My son-in-law walked him to the door, and they shook hands on the porch. On Thursday evening, I heard the gate on the side of my house open and close twice. My son-in-law carried 2 cardboard boxes from the garage to his car trunk in the dark. I was photographing all of it. On the 4th night, I heard footsteps on the porch of the vacant house. My entire body went still. I lowered the monocular and turned toward the door with my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over 911, running through explanations that a man with no legal right to be in this house could plausibly offer the responding officers. The door opened. A woman stepped through it, and the streetlight coming through the gap behind her caught white hair pulled back in a loose braid and the face of my neighbor from 4 houses down. "Dorothy," I said, which was not eloquent, but it was the only word I had. She closed the door behind her with the ease of someone entering a room she had reserved. She was 71 years old, a retired occupational therapist, and she had lived on this block 4 years longer than I had. She wore a canvas jacket and carried a thermos, and her expression held no surprise whatsoever at finding me sitting in the dark with surveillance equipment pointed at my own house. "I've been watching you watch them," she said. "I figured it was time we talked. How long have you known?" She set the thermos on the windowsill and pulled a small spiral notebook from her jacket pocket, long enough to have written some of it down. She flipped to a page near the middle. "The man in the gray sedan. His name is Gerald Fitch. I wrote down his license plate the second time he came, which was 3 weeks ago. You were still living in your house then?" I stared at her. 3 weeks ago? He came twice before you left." She kept her voice level, the way people do when they are delivering news they know will cause damage. I looked him up. He is a geriatric care consultant, the kind that assesses cognitive function. The room shifted slightly. Not from shock, from confirmation. They were building the record before they even suggested the vacation. The visits, the questions about my documents, the gentle observations about my memory at dinner. They had started weeks earlier than I realized. "How do you know all this?" I asked. She poured coffee from the thermos into the cap and offered it to me. "I've lived alone for 9 years. I pay attention to my street." She paused. "And because your daughter came to my door 6 weeks ago asking whether I had noticed any changes in you. Whether you seemed confused. Whether you repeated yourself." My hands tightened around the coffee cap. "What did you tell her?" Dorothy looked at me directly. "I told her you seemed exactly the same as you had for the last 15 years. She said nothing more about it. She pulled her chair up beside mine and raised her own small set of opera glasses to the window and settled into the work beside me the way someone does who has already decided to be in it. I did not ask why. I waited instead. After a while she said, "I had a husband who was doing this to his mother when I met him. I didn't know for the first 2 years. By the time I understood what was happening, she had lost control of her accounts. She passed before any of it was resolved." She said it with the flatness of something she had made peace with, by saying it many times. "I've thought about it ever since." "I understand," I said. "No," she said. "Not yet. But you will, when you see what they do tonight." She had predicted it the way she might predict rain after watching a specific formation of clouds. She had patterns. I didn't. At 11:40, a second car came, not the gray sedan, a black SUV with a California plate that she was already writing down before it stopped at the curb. A woman got out, late 30s, professional clothing at midnight, a document folder tucked under one arm. Dorothy said quietly, "She came once before, 2 weeks ago while you were still home. Your daughter met her in the driveway." My daughter opened the front door. The woman went inside. My son-in-law was already at the table. I raised the monocular. Dorothy raised her glasses. We both went quiet. What I could see through my own living room window was 3 people gathered around my dining table, the same table where I had eaten 30 years of breakfasts, helped my daughter with geometry, homework, Sat with my wife in the last months when she could still sit at a table. They spread documents across it with the comfort of people who had done this before. The woman from California laid out papers in sections. My son-in-law leaned forward and pointed at something. My daughter sat back slightly, arms crossed, but she did not leave the table and she did not push the papers away. Dorothy said, "The woman with the folder. I think she may be an attorney." I photographed what I could through the window. 60 yards with window glare was difficult but not impossible, and the timestamps mattered as much as the clarity. At 12:20, voices came through the gap in the window Dorothy had quietly opened 2 inches. The attorney's voice, carrying on the still June air. If the assessment from Dr. Fitch supports diminished capacity, the petition timeline accelerates. We'd be looking at a conservatorship hearing within 90 days. My son-in-law, that's what we need. The property plus the investment accounts. The Coast Place. My daughter said something I could not make out clearly. The attorney again. The key is documentation. Behavioral observations, date stamped. The more consistent the record, the stronger the case. My son-in-law, we've been building that for 4 months. 4 months. While I was making Sunday dinners in my own kitchen and asking about their job search and thinking my daughter was finally letting me back into her life. 4 months. Dorothy touched my arm. She said nothing. She did not need to. I breathed. Let the wave come through and pass. Then I raised my phone and kept photographing. The meeting ended at 1 in the morning. The California attorney walked out first. My son-in-law walked her to her car and they spoke briefly on the sidewalk. Handshake. She drove away. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the neighborhood, and I held myself perfectly still in the dark behind a window 30 feet from where I had a clear view of his face. He looked satisfied. He went back inside. The lights went out by 1:30. Dorothy poured the last of the coffee and we sat in the dark without speaking for a while. "What will you do?" she asked finally. I said, "The same thing I did for 32 years when someone's heart was in trouble. Stabilize first, then diagnose, then act." She nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Your notes. And your testimony, if it comes to that." She closed her notebook and held it out to me without hesitation. I drove back to the motel and did not sleep. Instead, I opened my legal pad and began listing what I had and what I still needed. I had surveillance photographs with timestamps. I had Dorothy's written observations going back 6 weeks. I had overheard testimony. I had the name Gerald Fitch and the name of a California attorney I would identify by morning. What I needed was the documents themselves, the assessment reports, the petition paperwork, the forged or manipulated records they would use in court. Without those, I had strong evidence of intent, but limited evidence of the specific fraud. That meant I needed to go back inside my own house. Thursday morning. My daughter went to yoga at 8:15. I had watched that schedule for 6 weeks without knowing I was doing it. The way you accumulate knowledge about people you live alongside without categorizing it as intelligence. My son-in-law worked from home but took a standing call from 9 to 10 every Thursday that he conducted from the back patio with his headphones on, facing the garden. 25 minutes. That was my window. I parked around the corner and walked to my own front door with my key in my hand, moving at a normal pace, the pace of a homeowner and not an intruder, because I was a homeowner and not an intruder. The lock turned. The door opened. The house smelled the way it always had, coffee and old wood, and the faint cedar from the closet inserts my wife had chosen 20 years ago. It felt wrong to be moving quietly through it. I went directly to the guest room, which my son-in-law had converted into a working space. The desk was organized with the precision of someone who understood numbers, everything labeled, everything sorted. I pulled the bottom drawer. The files were there. A full accordion folder with my name on the label tab. Not their name. My name. As if they had already taken ownership of the documentation of my own cognitive state. I spread the contents on the desk and photographed each page. Gerald Fitch's preliminary assessment report, dated 6 weeks prior. Noted concerns about executive function. Observed hesitation in recall tasks. Mild inconsistency in chronological orientation. Every sentence clinical. every sentence designed to seed doubt rather than establish fact. I had administered enough cognitive assessments during my career to recognize the difference between a legitimate finding and a record being manufactured toward a predetermined conclusion. He had seen me twice. I had not known either visit was an assessment. The petition draft, prepared by a law firm out of San Francisco. Petitioner listed as my daughter, supported by co-petitioner, my son-in-law. The basis: progressive cognitive decline, rendering the respondent unable to manage financial affairs or make sound decisions regarding assets. The remedy sought: full conservatorship of person and estate. Beneath the petition draft, a separate document I almost missed. A property valuation for my coast house, completed by a Washington real estate broker, and a preliminary listing agreement, not signed yet, but drafted. The broker's name was at the top. The listed seller was not me. It was my son-in-law's LLC. I stood very still with that page in my hands. My Washington property was in my name alone. For it to be listed under his LLC, the ownership would need to have been transferred, which meant there was either a transfer document I had never signed, or one that I had signed without understanding what I was signing, or one that bore my signature without my knowledge. I pulled out every remaining page in the folder, and I found it. A quitclaim deed dated 8 months prior, transferring the Washington coastal property from my name to my son-in-law's LLC for $1 in consideration. Signed, ostensibly, by me. I know my own signature. I have signed my name at the bottom of 32 years of medical records, clinical notes, legal documents, letters of recommendation, and research papers. I know the particular leftward lean of my capital R, the way I close the loop on my lowercase d, the slightly elevated crossbar on my lowercase t. This signature had none of that. Someone had copied the shape of my name without understanding the architecture of it. The proportions were right. The flow was wrong. I photographed every page from 6 different angles. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it. I walked back out through my own front door at 8:53, 7 minutes before my window closed. Sitting in my car around the corner, I called Dorothy. I said, "I have the documents. Forged deed, fabricated assessment, full petition." She was quiet a moment. "When will you move?" "Not yet. I need 3 things in place first. Then I'm going to let them walk all the way to the edge before I stop them." She said, "You sound like a man who's done this before." I said, 32 years of watching people's hearts fail teaches you one thing. The moment you intervene matters as much as how you intervene. The next 6 days were the most precise work of my life, and I had spent decades performing procedures where a millimeter mattered. The first morning, I drove to the county assessor's office and filed a formal notice of dispute regarding the quitclaim deed transfer, attaching my sworn affidavit that I had never executed or authorized the transfer, never received consideration, and had no knowledge of the document until 48 hours prior. The clerk was 20 years from retirement and stamped the paperwork with the practiced gravity of someone who had seen this particular kind of trouble before. The notice created a legal cloud on the title that no buyer's attorney would allow to close through without resolution. That afternoon, I went to see Patricia Ng. I had known Patricia since she was a second-year law student doing a rotation in the medical center where I worked. She had become one of the better estate and elder law attorneys in Portland, and she owed me a favor in the way that people owe favors when someone writes a letter that changes the trajectory of a career. I had written hers 22 years earlier. I laid out the facts across her conference table without embellishment and without emotion. The conservatorship petition being prepared, the fabricated assessment, the forged deed, Dorothy's documentation, my surveillance photographs. She read through everything twice before speaking. "The deed forgery is criminal," she said. "The conservatorship petition, if filed on the basis of a fabricated assessment, is fraud on the court." She looked up at me. "You know what this means for your daughter." "I know." She held my gaze. "You're certain?" A cardiology colleague of mine once asked me something similar before I testified in a malpractice case involving a surgeon who had been his resident. I gave him the same answer then. I said, "What I am certain of is that if we do not stop this, someone else becomes the next victim. My certainty about that is the only certainty that matters. Patricia nodded slowly and began drafting. She filed 3 documents with Multnomah County Circuit Court over the following 2 days. A motion to void the fraudulent quitclaim deed pending forensic handwriting analysis. A preemptive declaration establishing my cognitive competency, supported by a formal neuropsychological evaluation I completed in one afternoon at a clinic across town. My scores were in the 91st percentile for my age group. The evaluating psychologist noted in her report that the subject demonstrated exceptional executive function and working memory. I kept 3 certified copies of that report. The 3rd document Patricia filed was a motion to compel disclosure of any conservatorship petitions pending or in preparation involving my name, giving opposing parties 10 days to respond. On my way home from Patricia's office, I stopped at Providence Medical Center and spoke for 40 minutes with a forensic document examiner. I had referred patients to over the years when their cases involved contested signatures. She agreed to conduct an expedited analysis of the quitclaim deed signature for a fee that I paid without negotiating. Her written report came back in 4 days. Conclusion: the examined signature does not match the known exemplars provided. Significant deviation in pen pressure, letter formation sequence, and connection style. High probability that the examined signature was produced by a different individual attempting to replicate the subject's handwriting style. I added it to the folder. By the time I returned from my supposed vacation, I had 4 folders organized by color and numbered by evidentiary weight. Dorothy had added 12 pages of dated observations to her notebook. Patricia had 3 court filings active. The county had a disputed title notice on record, and I had a neuropsychological evaluation confirming that the man whose capacity they planned to challenge was, according to every measurable standard, entirely competent. I drove home on a Sunday afternoon and pulled into my driveway at 3:15 with fishing gear in my truck bed that I had never used and a suitcase of clothes I had barely worn. My son-in-law came out to help carry things before I was fully out of the truck. His smile arrived correctly. His eyes made a quick calculation before settling. "You're back early," he said. "Something in my lower back," I said. "Wasn't worth pushing through." He nodded with practiced sympathy. My daughter came down the front steps and hugged me, and I let her, and I held the hug 1 beat longer than necessary, long enough to feel the tension she was carrying that she was trying to hide. Inside the house, she made tea, and they sat with me at the kitchen table and asked about the trip in the careful, attentive way of people performing consideration. I answered vaguely, "A little forgetful lately," I admitted, which was a lie I delivered with the precision of a man who had learned to manage information in courtrooms. I set my tea mug in the wrong spot, deliberately, let my eyes unfocus for a moment when my son-in-law asked me a direct question. Took slightly too long to retrieve the answer. His shoulders relaxed by a degree I would not have noticed if I had not been watching for exactly that. My daughter said gently, "Dad, I've noticed that too. A little more than before." "Have you?" I said, as if the thought was new to me. My son-in-law said, "It's probably nothing, but it might be worth talking to someone, just to be on the safe side." My hand went to my pocket, where the voice recorder was running. Everything was being captured. Over the next 3 days, I gave them exactly what they needed to feel certain they had this under control. I asked my daughter twice about something she had already told me. I left the stove on for 10 minutes longer than I should have, which I had never done in my life. I mentioned the coast house and then said, or was it the mountains? As if I could not quite locate my own property in my memory. My son-in-law's posture changed by the second day. He moved through my house with a different quality of ownership. He used my desk without asking. He went through the mail on the hallway table. He made phone calls from my kitchen that he did not end when I walked in. My daughter avoided my eyes. On the 3rd night, I stood in the darkened hallway outside the guest room and listened through the door. My son-in-law's voice, low and certain. "Fitch's assessment plus what we've documented this week. That's enough. We file Monday." My daughter, quieter. "And the coast property is already listed? It goes active the same day we file. Concurrent." She said something I could not make out. Then, what if he contests it? He said, "With what?" He barely remembered where the property was yesterday. His own words. His own manufactured words. I lifted my phone and recorded 17 seconds of conversation through a half-inch gap in a doorway in my own house, then walked back to my bedroom with the kind of steadiness that comes not from calm but from absolute certainty of purpose. I texted Patricia from under the covers. "They're filing Monday. I want to be at the title company when the coast listing goes active." She responded in 4 minutes. Already arranged. "Tuesday, 10 a.m., Westside Title. I'll be there. Bring Dorothy." I closed my phone and slept better than I had in months. Tuesday morning. I dressed in the dark before either of them was awake. Navy sport coat, the one I wore for hospital board meetings. The folder Patricia had prepared sat in my briefcase alongside my own documentation. I went downstairs, made coffee, left a note on the counter saying I had a doctor's appointment. Routine, harmless. Exactly what they expected from a man whose grip on his own affairs was loosening. Dorothy was waiting in her car 2 blocks down. She was wearing the kind of composed expression that people wear when they have been preparing for something for a long time, and the day has finally arrived. She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "I've been ready since I found those scratch marks on my filing cabinet." We drove across the river to Westside Title. Patricia was in the parking lot. She gave me a brief nod, and we went in. The conference room was on the 2nd floor, glass-walled and already occupied. My son-in-law sat on the left side of the table in a jacket I did not recognize, which told me he had purchased it for this occasion. Beside him sat a man I identified immediately as Gerald Fitch from the photograph on his professional website. Across from them, a young title officer organized paperwork with the distracted efficiency of someone processing a routine transaction. A woman I did not recognize sat at the far end of the table with a document folder. California attorney. The same one from the midnight meeting. I opened the door. The conversation stopped before I fully entered the room. My son-in-law's face passed through 4 expressions in approximately 1 second and arrived at a mask of controlled surprise that was not quite tight enough. He said, "What are you doing here?" I set my briefcase on the table and opened it. I took my time. "Good morning." My voice had the same register it used when I addressed hospital grand rounds, the register that does not invite interruption. "I'm Raymond Holt. I believe you are currently processing a property transaction involving my coastal home." The title officer looked up. "You're the owner of record?" "I am." I placed the county dispute notice in front of her. "This transaction cannot proceed. That property is subject to an active title dispute filed 6 days ago, and the transfer of ownership you may be relying on is the subject of a pending court challenge on grounds of forgery." The California attorney said, "Mr. Holt, I think there may be some confusion here." "There is no confusion on my side," I said. Patricia placed the deed challenge motion in front of the attorney. Multnomah County Circuit Court. Filed last week. You can verify the case number. My son-in-law's voice came out flat. "We have documentation of your cognitive state. You have a diagnosed impairment." I looked at him for a moment. Then I opened my second folder and removed the neuropsychological evaluation. I placed it on the table so everyone could read the letterhead. I said, "I had a full evaluation 12 days ago, 91st percentile executive function for my age." I removed the forensic document examiner's report. I said, "The signature on your quitclaim deed is not mine. That is the written conclusion of a forensic examiner with 19 years of experience and court-certified standing." Gerald Fitch had not moved or spoken since I entered the room. I turned to him directly. "Dr. Fitch, I read your preliminary assessment. I noticed you characterized 2 incidents of hesitation in recall tasks as clinically significant. I'd like to know the date and setting of those incidents, because I don't recall interacting with you in any context I understood to be a clinical assessment." He said, "Your daughter arranged the meetings. My daughter was present during all contact?" He shifted in his chair. "In both instances, yes," I said. "Then, you should be aware that conducting a cognitive assessment on an individual without their knowledge or informed consent is an ethical violation of the standards of your licensing board. I've already sent a formal complaint." Patricia laid the complaint confirmation on the table. "You may want to consider your exposure here carefully. Fitch stood up. He picked up his folder, said something to the title officer about needing to verify the scope of his engagement, and left the room without looking at my son-in-law. The title officer looked between the remaining people at the table. She said, "I'm going to need to pause this transaction pending resolution of the title dispute. I'm also obligated to note these documents for our compliance file." The California attorney said, "I'll need a moment to consult with my clients." She pulled her phone out. My son-in-law leaned toward her and said something low. She shook her head. Dorothy, who had been sitting beside Patricia in the back of the room, and whom my son-in-law had not acknowledged because he did not think she was relevant, opened her notebook. She said in the clear, precise voice of a woman who had spent 40 years in clinical settings, "I have 7 weeks of dated observations of activity at the respondent's property, including 2 visits from Dr. Fitch prior to the respondent's absence, and a recorded midnight meeting on June 17th. I am prepared to testify to all of it." My son-in-law looked at her for the first time. He said nothing. I removed my recorder from my breast pocket and pressed play. My son-in-law's voice, clear through the small speaker. "Fitch's assessment plus what we've documented this week, that's enough. We file Monday." My daughter's voice responding, his voice continuing, "With what?" He barely remembered where the property was yesterday. The room was completely silent, except for the recorded voices of 2 people who had believed they were speaking privately in a house where no one was watching. I stopped the recording. I addressed the title officer. "I want it noted for your file that I never had any diminished cognitive function, that the documentation presented to support that claim was fabricated, and that the individual who organized this scheme arranged for a geriatric assessment of a competent adult without his knowledge or consent as part of a broader fraud." The title officer was already typing. The attorney said quietly to my son-in-law, "I'm going to need to withdraw." He said, "You can't just..." She said, "I can, and I am." She gathered her folder, stood, and looked at me with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile. "I apologize for my role in this. I was misled about the nature of the documentation." I said, "I appreciate that. I'd encourage you to document what you were told versus what you now know. It will matter." She left. My son-in-law sat at the table for a moment longer. He looked at me across the documents spread between us, and I saw something in his face that was not the calculation I had watched for weeks. It was the look of someone who has run out of moves and knows it. He said, "This isn't what you think." I said, "I spent 32 years listening to people tell me things were not what they appeared to be. I became very good at determining when that was true. This is not one of those times." I closed my briefcase. I said to Patricia, "The criminal complaint is ready?" She said, "Filed this morning. Forgery, fraud, and conspiracy." I looked at my son-in-law one last time. I said, "You will need to be out of my house by the end of this week. If your things are not gone by Friday, I will have them removed. Do not contact me except through an attorney." He opened his mouth and I turned away and walked out. In the elevator, Dorothy said nothing until the doors closed. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "The way I feel after a difficult procedure. It's not over yet." But the critical moment passed without catastrophe. She said, "What about your daughter?" I had been carrying that question for the entire preceding week, turning it over the way you turn over something that has sharp edges. I said, "She made choices. She'll face the consequences of those choices. But I'm not ready to consider her unrecoverable." That was the most honest thing I said in all of it. Over the following 3 weeks, the case moved through the system the way legal cases do, grinding and incremental and unglamorous. Patricia handled the criminal referrals. Forgery charges were filed against my son-in-law relating to the quitclaim deed. Conspiracy charges were added when it emerged through discovery that the California attorney had been engaged by my son-in-law under false pretenses, and that Fitch had been directed to conduct the assessments under a cover story about routine elder care consultations. Fitch's licensing board opened a separate investigation. My daughter was not charged. The evidence of her specific role did not meet the threshold for prosecution, though the civil complaint Patricia filed named her in connection with the Coast property scheme. That case was still pending when I last updated this. She called me 6 weeks after everything collapsed. The conversation was difficult in the way that conversations are difficult when the person on the other end knows they have done something that cannot be undone and does not yet know how to begin speaking about it. We did not resolve anything, but she called. My son-in-law accepted a plea agreement that included probation, community service, restitution, and a permanent bar from serving as a fiduciary or financial agent for any individual over 65. His name went into a registry. Whatever shape his life takes from here, it will carry that. The coast property stayed in my name. The quitclaim deed was formally voided. The county struck the fraudulent transfer from the record. I hired a locksmith the day after the title company meeting and changed every lock in my house and my shed and the gate on the side fence. I set up a proper security system that I chose and understand and control. I met with an actual estate attorney, a different one, and set up a legitimate revocable trust with named trustees who are not family members. Dorothy and I started a weekly coffee arrangement. She brings the thermos. I make the eggs. We are working with 2 other neighbors on a neighborhood watch structure specifically designed to protect residents over 60 from financial exploitation. There is more need for this than most people realize. The isolation that comes with age, the desire to believe your family is trustworthy, the way cognitive decline can be manufactured from nothing when someone is motivated enough to manufacture it, these are not rare circumstances. They are patterns. I know them now in a way I did not 6 months ago. There are things I wish had gone differently. I wish my daughter had said something to me instead of becoming part of it. I wish I had noticed the scratch marks on the cabinet 4 months earlier. I wish the friendship with my son-in-law had been what it pretended to be, because the version of him that did not exist was someone I genuinely liked. But I learned something in 32 years of standing at the edge of cardiac events and making decisions in the specific kind of silence that exists when a monitor alarm has stopped and the room is waiting. I learned that the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one is almost never capability. It is almost always whether someone was paying attention. I was paying attention. In the end, that was enough. If this story reached something in you, please like the video and subscribe to Ember Vengeance. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. If you have ever faced something similar, or if someone you know is facing it right now, I would very much like to hear about it. The next story is waiting for you in the box to the left. Take care of yourself out there, and pay attention.